The year was 1955. Las Vegas glittered like a mirage, a desert paradise built on neon, whiskey, and illusions. To the public, it was the new capital of dreams, where America's finest voices turned sin into spectacle. But beneath the lights, the stage belonged to someone else. Every club, every contract, every song had a price. The Mafia had quietly moved west, trading guns for gambling chips and control for applause. They didn't need to own the singers. They only needed to own the microphones they sang into. It was the perfect deal. The stars got fame, fortune, and protection. The mob got money, power, and silence. And the crowd, they got the illusion of freedom. Frank Sinatra crooned about love while mobsters watched from the front row. Dean Martin joked through his fear. Sammy Davis Jr. danced in defiance, knowing who truly kept him safe. Tony Bennett's velvet voice floated through smoky rooms, built with blood money. They all played their part in the show, the beautiful lie that America called entertainment. Because in Las Vegas, music wasn't just art, it was business, it was control, and the men who ran it never appeared in the spotlight, because they were the spotlight's owners. They called it protection, the narrator whispers, but in truth, it was possession. Frank Sinatra, the comeback the mob built. By the early 1950s, Frank Sinatra was finished. His records weren't selling, his film career had collapsed, and his marriage to Ava Gardner was crumbling in the public eye. Once hailed as the voice, Sinatra was now seen as yesterday's news. Washed up, volatile, and unemployable. In a world obsessed with youth and control, there are only two kinds of stars, the protected and the forgotten. Sinatra refused to be the latter. That's when the men from Chicago came calling. Sam Giancana, a ruthless but charismatic boss of the Chicago outfit, admired Sinatra's music. He saw in him not just a singer, but a tool. Vegas was booming, and the mob needed legitimate faces to draw the crowds. Sinatra was perfect, famous, desperate, and easy to manipulate. It began with favors, a new recording contract here, a sold-out weekend there. Then came introductions to the owners of the Sands, the Flamingo, the Desert Inn. Men with thick wallets and thicker records. Overnight, Sinatra's career roared back to life. He had a seat at every high roller's table and a microphone waiting whenever he wanted it. But those stages didn't belong to him. They belonged to the men who paid for them. Mafia protection in Las Vegas wasn't about keeping people safe. It was about ownership. The outfit financed the casinos, the unions, even the orchestras. If a singer didn't cooperate, the shows vanished. The phone stopped ringing, or worse. Sinatra learned quickly. He played along, charming, loyal, and silent. He sang for crowds filled with mobsters, politicians, and sometimes both. Behind the stage curtains, deals were made, debts were settled, and secrets were buried. And then, the whispers began. FBI wiretaps caught Giancana's name mentioned alongside Sinatra's more times than anyone could explain. Reporters snapped photos of them together at private clubs, of Sinatra shaking hands with men already under federal indictment. The illusion of freedom was cracking. When John F. Kennedy rose to power, Sinatra believed his redemption had arrived. Kennedy's charisma matched his own, and Frank threw himself into the campaign, singing, performing, and hosting. Behind the scenes, Giancana used Sinatra as a bridge to the White House, offering help that no one wanted to acknowledge. But when the investigations closed in, Kennedy's team turned their backs on Sinatra. Fast. The White House cut off contact. FBI agents raided Sinatra's Vegas suites. Studio executives quietly froze his contracts. It was the perfect irony. The mob had built his comeback, and now the government used it to destroy him. Sinatra tried to distance himself. He burned letters, denied connections, even confronted Giancana in private. But in the world they both lived in, you didn't just walk away. You were released if they decided you were no longer useful. For Sinatra, freedom came not as a gift, but as an exile. The mob stopped calling, the politicians stopped visiting, and his name became a liability. The man who had once stood in every spotlight was now performing to prove his innocence, to show he belonged to no one. In public, he smiled again. On stage, his voice regained its confidence, smooth and unshaken. But those close to him said something had changed. The laughter was forced, the eyes colder. He had survived the Mafia's embrace, but not without scars. Every friend lost, every deal undone, every headline whispering mob ties was a reminder of the invisible chain he could never quite break. Years later, when asked about those days, Sinatra never denied, but never confirmed. He'd simply say, "I did what I had to do to sing." And in that single sentence lay the truth of every star who ever dealt with the darkness. You can escape the mob, but you can never escape the price of their protection. Dean Martin, the mob's favorite gentleman. Dean Martin made fame look effortless. While Sinatra fought his way back with sweat and rage, Martin floated through the chaos like smoke curling from a cigarette, always smiling, always calm. To the audience, he was the embodiment of cool, the man who never cared too much, never tried too hard. But that calm, as it turned out, came with a cost. Behind the charm was a quiet deal, the kind that wasn't written on paper, but carved into silence. When Dean Martin split from Jerry Lewis in 1956, everyone expected him to fade away. Jerry had the energy, the slapstick, the spotlight. Dean had nothing but a drink and a grin. But in the desert of Las Vegas, charm was currency, and Martin was about to meet the man who could turn it into gold, Johnny Roselli. They called him the Hollywood diplomat of the Chicago outfit, a man who wore suits like armor and spoke with the calm of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be dangerous. Roselli understood how the entertainment world worked. He didn't threaten stars, he made them. He gave Dean everything the studios had taken away. A residency at the Sands Hotel, exclusive slots on the Strip, a cut of the tables when the shows sold out. Overnight, Martin became Vegas royalty, his name glowing above every marquee, his face plastered on every billboard. But the spotlight, as always, came with shadows. When the Mafia helped you, it wasn't a favor. It was an investment. Dean performed not just for the crowds, but for the bosses who sat up front. Their laughter a little too loud, their eyes a little too sharp. They adored him because he made them look good, clean, classy, untouchable. Every night he toasted to them with a glass of scotch, joking his way through songs like "Ain't That a Kick in the Head?" The audience heard comedy, the mob heard obedience. He never talked business, but business always surrounded him. Roselli handled his contracts, arranged his tours, even smoothed over tax discrepancies. And when FBI agents began sniffing around, Roselli told Dean not to worry. The government didn't touch entertainers. But that wasn't true. The FBI had files on every member of the Rat Pack, Sinatra, Davis, Martin, tracking their movements through the same casinos and clubs owned by the outfit. Dean's name appeared repeatedly, always next to Roselli's, always marked under observation. He laughed it off. That was his defense mechanism. Laughter. It kept fear at bay, and fear was the one thing the mob could smell like blood. Then in 1976, everything changed. Roselli's body was found stuffed into a 55-gallon oil drum floating off the coast of Miami. His death wasn't subtle. It was a message, a warning to everyone who thought they could leave the game. Dean didn't talk about it publicly. He didn't attend the funeral. He simply went quiet. Friends said he withdrew from the social scene, stopped calling old contacts, and started drinking more. The effortless cool turned hollow. He kept working, of course. The show had to go on. It always did. But something in him had broken. Without Roselli's protection, Dean was no longer the mob's favorite gentleman, just another aging star trying to stay relevant. His phone stopped ringing as often. The casinos moved on to younger acts. He wasn't blacklisted, but he was quietly replaced. For the rest of his life, Dean never confirmed his relationship with Roselli or the outfit. When reporters asked, he'd smile that same lazy grin and say, "You know me, I don't talk business." It was the perfect answer, the kind that meant everything and nothing at the same time. But those who knew him best said that behind closed doors he carried guilt, not for what he'd done, but for what he'd survived. He had seen what happened to people who crossed the line, and he'd played the part of the obedient entertainer so well that even the mob began to believe he didn't care. That was his armor, his disguise, his survival. In the end, Dean Martin lived like he performed, smooth, detached, and unbothered. But when the curtain finally fell, all that remained was the echo of a man who had laughed his way through fear. He had been protected. He had been adored. And when the protection was gone, so was the magic. In Las Vegas, the narrator says softly, he played the gentleman everyone wanted him to be, until the gentleman who made him disappeared. Sammy Davis Jr., the price of protection. He called himself the world's greatest entertainer, and in many ways he was. Sammy Davis Jr. could sing, dance, act, play the drums, tell jokes. There was nothing he couldn't do. But in 1950s America, talent wasn't enough. Not when your skin was black, your girlfriend was white, and the stage you stood on was owned by men who measured worth in money and fear. Sammy learned early that Las Vegas wasn't built for people like him. He could headline the biggest casinos on the Strip, the Sands, the Flamingo, the Frontier. But after the applause faded, he had to leave through the back door. He couldn't stay in the hotels he performed in, couldn't use the pool, couldn't eat in the restaurants. To the audience, he was a star. To the city, he was still just colored. Then came the offer that changed everything. Sam Giancana, the powerful Chicago boss who ruled Vegas behind the curtain, like Sammy, he saw profit in him. Protection, Giancana called it, a way to ensure the shows ran smooth, no threats, no protests, no cops hassling the casino owners for hiring a black man. And in return, Giancana wanted only one thing: loyalty. From that moment, Sammy Davis Jr. became untouchable. When racist groups sent threats, they disappeared. When a reporter tried to expose his interracial romance with actress Kim Novak, the man received a visit and dropped the story overnight. Hollywood whispered that Giancana had made a call. Whether that was true or not, one fact remained. Sammy's name stayed off the blacklist. But the arrangement came with chains. Giancana wasn't protecting him out of kindness. He was using him. The mob needed stars like Sammy and Sinatra to legitimize their casinos, to draw the kind of crowd that turned Vegas from a desert into an empire. So Sammy became part of the act. He smiled bigger, danced harder, pretended the world was fair. Off stage, it was different. He drank too much, barely slept, and kept his pistol nearby when he traveled. He knew the protection worked both ways. It kept him safe, but it also kept him owned. Then in 1961, things changed forever. Sammy married a white actress, Mae Britt. It was love, reckless in public, and in the eyes of America, it was a crime. Networks threatened to cancel his shows. The Kennedy campaign, fearful of backlash, uninvited him from the inauguration gala, an event Sinatra had promised him personally. But Giancana didn't care. As long as Sammy kept performing, Vegas was his to rule. The real trouble began when Giancana's empire started to crumble. The FBI closed in. Federal raids shook the Strip. One by one, the old mob faces vanished, arrested, exiled, or killed. And with them went Sammy's shield. Suddenly, the phone calls stopped coming. Casino owners grew cautious. TV producers whispered about bad associations. He was no longer protected, just exposed. In interviews, Sammy tried to laugh it off. He said he'd been lucky, that he'd never felt safer in his life. But his friends saw the truth. The charm was gone. The exhaustion had settled in. He was still working, still dazzling, but the sparkle in his eyes, the invincible energy, had dimmed. He once told a journalist, "When you're the only one in the room who looks like you never stop performing, even when the show's over." And maybe that was his tragedy. He had spent his life trying to prove he belonged, to Hollywood, to Vegas, to America. But in the end, he was still trapped in a deal he hadn't made, but couldn't escape. In 1967, he was nearly killed in a car crash on a desert highway. He lost his left eye. Some said it was bad luck. Others said it was a warning. Sammy himself joked about it later, because that's what he did. But those who were close to him said he changed after that night. He stopped believing in protection. Years later, when he looked back on the Vegas years, he said quietly, "They gave me the biggest stage in the world and the smallest space to stand on." He survived the mob, the racism, the scandals, and the silence. But survival isn't the same as freedom. By the time he died in 1990, the golden days of the Rat Pack were long gone. The lights of Vegas burned brighter than ever, but none of them were for him. He sang and danced his way through a minefield. The world loved the show, but never noticed the man who was bleeding behind it. Tony Bennett, the gentleman in the cage. Tony Bennett was the embodiment of class, the voice that made America fall in love with love. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't political. He wasn't wild. He was safe, or at least that's what people thought. Behind that elegance, behind the tuxedo and the velvet baritone, there was a quiet truth. Even the gentlest man in show business needed protection. And in the 1950s, protection always had a name and a price. Bennett came up at a time when Las Vegas was run like a kingdom, and every kingdom had its lords. Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld, ruled New York's gambling empire, but his reach stretched all the way to the desert. He didn't care about jazz or swing, but he understood one thing: music made money clean. Costello saw in Bennett a perfect investment, an image of purity the Mafia could use to legitimize their hotels and clubs. A man who'd never questioned where the checks came from. So when Tony's early singles began climbing the charts, doors opened faster than talent alone could explain. Residencies at the Flamingo, radio play on every major East Coast station, invitations to perform for private gatherings of casino owners who never smiled but always paid in cash. It all looked like luck. It was anything but. Bennett's manager quietly hinted that the right people believed in him. When he asked what that meant, he was told to stop asking. And so Tony did what good men often do in dangerous times. He looked away. While other singers stumbled under scandals and debts, Bennett thrived. He was the gentleman crooner, adored by critics and the mob alike. Vegas called him the safest bet in town. But the deeper his success grew, the tighter the cage became. He couldn't refuse a show, not when the invitations came from men like Costello or Meyer Lansky. He couldn't pick his set list. Certain songs were requested. He couldn't even control his public image. The mob-backed radio stations made sure his ballads played on repeat, while any mention of him as an independent artist mysteriously disappeared from press columns. He was loved, yes, but he wasn't free. Tony began to notice the pattern. Other performers who tried to cut ties, singers who questioned where the money came from, suddenly lost bookings, airtime, or worse. Some were audited by the IRS the next month. Others just vanished from the circuit. By the early 1960s, the illusion of safety began to crack. The FBI's investigations into organized crime reached the entertainment world. Agents started showing up at Vegas hotels, asking questions. Reporters whispered about mob-controlled crooners. Tony hated it. He'd spent his whole life building a reputation of integrity, and now the same machine that had lifted him up was threatening to bury him in scandal. One night, after a show at the Sands, he told a friend backstage, "It's a beautiful cage, isn't it? Gold bar, but still a cage." It was the first time he admitted, even privately, that he was trapped. So he made a decision. He left Vegas. He walked away from the residencies, the guaranteed money, the connections. He focused on concert tours, on albums recorded his way. Smaller, riskier, but honest. The punishment came swiftly. Radio stations that once played him daily stopped taking his calls. His airtime dried up. One major network lost an entire televised special. He wasn't blacklisted officially, just quietly erased from the Mafia's playlist. But Bennett didn't bend. He recorded albums of jazz standards that critics adored, even when sales lagged. He surrounded himself with real musicians, not fixers. And slowly, painfully, he rebuilt. This time without anyone pulling the strings. Years later, when he looked back on the Vegas years, he didn't speak in anger. He spoke with that same calm dignity that had defined him. He said, "Those were the times. Everyone was owned by someone. The trick was remembering who you were when the lights went out." Tony Bennett lived long enough to see Vegas transform from a gangster's paradise into a corporate theme park. But even in his old age, when asked if he'd ever go back, he just smiled faintly and said, "No, I left my cage there." He was the gentleman the mob couldn't corrupt. the narrator concludes softly, because while they could buy his stage, they could never buy his soul. Jerry Lewis and the Rat Pack. Laughter for the bosses. In the golden glow of Las Vegas, laughter was currency, and no one printed it better than Jerry Lewis. The man was chaos incarnate, elastic, loud, unpredictable. He could make an entire room forget its worries with a single fall, a single face, a single perfectly timed scream. To the world, he was comedy itself. But to the men who really ran the strip, Jerry Lewis was something else entirely. A guarantee. The Rat Pack, Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Lewis weren't just performers. They were the show that kept the Mafia's empire alive. Their appearances at the Sands and Flamingo didn't just draw crowds. They validated the business. The presence of these men, beloved by America, made the underworld look glamorous, charming, even patriotic. And that illusion was everything. Behind the curtains, Vegas wasn't just built on music and laughter. It was built on control, the kind that came with ledgers, threats, and envelopes full of cash. The outfit, the Chicago mob, and the East Coast families had divided the city among themselves. Each casino had an owner in the light and another in the dark. And for every night of glamour on stage, there was a quiet deal in the back room to make sure the stars stayed cooperative. Jerry Lewis didn't need convincing, at least not at first. He loved the spotlight. He loved Vegas, and the mob loved him back. Johnny Rosselli, the smooth-talking diplomat who handled Hollywood's dirty deals, took a liking to him. He arranged residencies, comedy specials, and private gigs that paid triple the usual rate. In return, Lewis performed for select audiences, mob bosses, casino investors, and their families, always under the polite fiction of private charity events. Those events weren't optional. To refuse an invitation was to insult men who weren't used to hearing the word no. To cancel a show meant losing more than money. It meant losing safety. Jerry, ever the showman, played along. He joked through it, made the gangsters laugh until their eyes watered, until they slapped the tables and demanded another drink. He gave them what they wanted: entertainment, distraction, and deniability. And in return, they gave him everything he thought he wanted: endless money, endless applause, and the illusion that he was untouchable. But illusions, like laughter, don't last forever. By the mid-1960s, the government's attention turned to Vegas. The FBI's Operation Stardust began tracking mafia involvement in casino profits. Every entertainer who'd ever played there, including the Rat Pack, became a name in a file. Jerry's connection to Rosselli suddenly wasn't a secret. He'd built his fame on comedy, but now his name appeared in a scandal. Reporters began hinting that his charity telethons, legitimate fundraisers for muscular dystrophy, were being skimmed by organized associates. No evidence ever surfaced, but in the world of show business, rumors can ruin faster than truth can repair. The mob didn't come to his defense. They never did when someone became inconvenient. When Johnny Rosselli was found murdered in 1976, cut, stuffed into an oil drum, and dumped into Biscayne Bay, Jerry didn't say a word publicly, but those who knew him said it broke something inside him. He stopped performing in Vegas for a while. His humor changed. Darker, sharper, more desperate. On stage, he still played the fool, but the timing was different. The laughter came faster, louder like a shield. The irony was cruel. The mob that once protected him had made him invincible. But once they were gone, the protection vanished. And so did the magic. By the late 1970s, Jerry Lewis was no longer Vegas's golden child. New comics came, slicker, cleaner, untouched by the old stains of the strip. He tried to modernize: television specials, guest appearances, film comebacks. But something in him always seemed haunted. In private interviews decades later, Lewis admitted the truth without naming names. Vegas used to be run by people who cared about the show. Now it's run by people who care about numbers. But back then, if you didn't make the right people laugh, you didn't come back. He wasn't exaggerating. Laughter had kept him alive, literally. And so the man who once defined joy became the living proof that even happiness can be a weapon in the right hands. He danced for devils in dinner jackets, the narrator says softly, and when the devils disappeared, he found that the laughter went with them. The Rat Pack would scatter, Sinatra chasing politics, Martin retreating into silence, Davis into exhaustion. Jerry was the last clown standing, and he carried the ghost of that era until the end of his life. Because in Las Vegas, comedy wasn't innocent. It was the sound of survival. And the silence that followed was the sound of freedom. Louis Prima and Keely Smith, the lovers of the flamingo. Before Elvis, before rock and roll, Las Vegas had Louis Prima, a trumpet, a wild grin, and a sound that could make even the most jaded high roller tap his glass to the rhythm. When he sang, the room moved, half Italian swing, half hurricane. And when Keely Smith joined him, everything changed. Together they were electricity, a love story, a band, a brand. But like every great act in Vegas, someone else owned the stage beneath their feet. The Flamingo Hotel was no ordinary venue. It was the dream and the downfall of Bugsy Siegel, the mobster who turned the desert into a kingdom of lights. After Siegel's execution in 1947, his partners, Meyer Lansky and the other East Coast bosses, took over the empire. By the time Louis and Keely began headlining there in the 1950s, the casino was still soaked in the same blood that built it. Louis didn't mind. He wasn't naive. He knew who signed the checks. But to him, the mob was just another part of show business. They paid on time, he joked once, and they never asked for encores. The truth was darker. The Mafia didn't just pay him, they owned him. Prima's shows were loud, wild, and profitable, exactly what the Flamingo needed to stay full. Every night, mob bosses sat in the front row, cigars glowing under the dim lights, watching their investment perform. When the band got tired, the men in suits would lean over to the pit boss and murmur, "Another set," and Louis would play. He didn't complain, not openly. After all, being the king of the strip was better than being forgotten. But behind the laughter, the exhaustion crept in. He was working 6 nights a week, sometimes 3 shows a night, with the same energy that had once made him famous. And Keely, his wife, his voice, his anchor, began to crack under the pressure. She loved the music but hated the world that came with it. The endless nights, the gambling, the shadowy men who treated their art like an investment. Still, she kept singing, because to stop would mean more than losing a paycheck. It would mean defying the people who made the rules. Vegas loved to claim it gave artists freedom. But for Louis and Keely, it was a velvet cage, gilded and guarded. When the mob wanted them to smile, they smiled. When the mob wanted romance, they kissed on stage, even when their marriage was falling apart backstage. The illusion of love sold tickets. The truth didn't matter. By the early 1960s, the act began to crumble. Keely filed for divorce. Louis tried to go solo, but the magic, the balance, was gone. The bookings got smaller, the checks got lighter. The same casino bosses who once begged for encores now pretended not to know him. When corporate money replaced mob money in Vegas, the old performers became disposable. The new management wanted younger faces, newer sounds. Louis Prima, once the heartbeat of the strip, was quietly pushed aside. One night, an old stagehand found him sitting alone in the empty Flamingo ballroom, staring at the stage that used to belong to him. He wasn't angry, just tired. He looked up and said softly, "Vegas made me. Vegas unmade me." It wasn't bitterness. It was truth. He'd been the soundtrack of a kingdom built by criminals. And when the kingdom changed hands, the music no longer mattered. Louis Prima would fade into obscurity, performing smaller shows across the country. His name now a nostalgic echo of a wilder, freer time that never truly existed. Keely went her own way, singing softer songs, the kind you sing after you've survived something dangerous. Years later, when she was asked about those nights at the Flamingo, she didn't name names. She just smiled and said, "We sang for the men who ran the world. And when they were done with us, they changed the station." In the end, the narrator whispers, their love was real, their fame was real, but their freedom was never theirs. Because in Vegas, even love had an owner. And as the lights of the Flamingo fade to black, only the echo of a trumpet remains, distant, defiant, and fading. When the final trumpet faded and the last curtain fell, the desert went silent. The men who once ruled Las Vegas with whispers and handshakes were gone. Some dead, some imprisoned, others retired into quiet anonymity. And the stars they made, the singers, the crooners, the comedians, were left standing in the spotlight alone, blinking against the light, unsure who they were without the shadow that had shaped them. For years, the Mafia's protection had been their armor. Now stripped of it, they discovered that freedom was lonelier than fear. Frank Sinatra spent the rest of his life defending his name, swearing that his ties were only friendships. Dean Martin drank to silence the ghosts of men like Rosselli, who had built his empire and then vanished in oil drums. Sammy Davis Jr. danced himself into exhaustion, chasing applause that no longer filled the void John Connor had once shielded him from. Tony Bennett turned his back on the strip entirely, carrying the quiet pride of a man who had escaped the gilded cage. Jerry Lewis laughed until it hurt, because laughter was all he had left. And Louis Prima, the trumpet that once made Vegas roar, ended his days in obscurity, his voice echoing in empty halls. Each of them, in their own way, survived. But none of them left untouched, because when the Mafia fell, it didn't take Hollywood's darkness with it. It only changed its shape. The new bosses wore suits instead of silk, wielded contracts instead of guns. But the game stayed the same. Control never truly disappears. It just rebrands itself as business. Hollywood thought it was free, the narrator whispers, the tone low and deliberate. But freedom isn't the end of the story. It's where the real price begins.